Hi everyone, welcome back to the MacKids Streaming Schoolhouse. Thank you so much for joining us today for our social studies class. Excuse me. Today we have two guest teachers with us, authors Deborah Heiligman and Karen Blumenthal, who are going to give us some quick social studies lessons based on their books. Deb, Karen, if you want to give a wave, say hello to everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
Before I turn things fully over to our two guest teachers, I do have a couple of housekeeping tips for all of our attendees. If you've been here before at the Streaming Schoolhouse, this is going to sound very familiar to you, but if you're joining us for the first time, there's lots of good information here, so do pay attention. If you are unfamiliar with Zoom Webinar, which is the platform that we're using today, the only people that you'll be able to hear and see are the presenters, so that's myself and Deb and Karen. We will not be able to hear and see you, and you will not be able to hear and see your fellow attendees, so nobody has to worry about any audio or visual interference happening on their end. During the course of the presentation, if you do have any tech issues, if you're unable at any point to not hear or see any of the presenters, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen that you can use to send a message to one of our staff members. Just click on that Q&A button and type out your message, and someone from our team will be in touch with you to help troubleshoot any issues you might be having. We do ask that during the author presentations, you do use that button only for tech questions, and just note that you will not be able to chat with your fellow attendees using that feature. After Deborah and Karen are done with their lessons, we are going to open things up to the audience for questions. So again, we're going to use that Q&A button that you can see at the bottom of your screen. You can type out your questions there, and I'll read them aloud to the author so that all the attendees can hear it. If you're a young reader who has a question for one of our authors and think that maybe you're going to need some help typing out your question, there'll be plenty of time to get a parent or guardian to help you. We also ask that you include your name and your age so that we can make sure that those questions are answered first. We want to prioritize some of the kid questions. We are also recording this session, so if you do run into any tech problems that we can't help you fix on your end, know that the session will be saved and we are going to be sending it out widely to everyone who registered for the event in the coming weeks. So if your internet fails you today, we have you covered, and we'll make sure that this is available to anyone who is interested. Last and most importantly, we just want to let everyone know that at Macmillan, we expect all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect and fairness. Anyone who violates the standards of this behavior, including engaging in any form of harassment, may, at the discretion of the organizers, be immediately removed from the event. So now, without any further ado, I am going to turn things over to our guest teachers for the day. We're going to start off with Debra Heiligman. Deborah has written many books for children, including the Prince Honor and Yalsa Nonfiction Award winner, Vincent and Theo, the National Book Award finalists, Charles and Emma, and the picture book, The Boy Who Loved Math. Deborah lives with her family in New York City. Take it away, Deb.
Hi, everybody. How are you? I am so happy to be here today. Well, here being in my office where I pretty much always am, except when I'm walking my puppy. But today I get to talk to you about my new book, newish book, Torpedoed. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. And so Torpedoed is the story of a ship during World War II that was torpedoed. I knew very little about the story before I started working on it, and I'm going to give you some of my secrets of how I did my research and suggest ways that you might want to do research too. It's not an unsimilar, whoops, I'm having trouble forwarding my, here we go. Okay, sorry. It's not an unsimilar time period. This was, of course, a long time ago in 1940, almost 80 years ago. People were scared because in England, because Hitler was bombing every night and everybody had to stay inside at night because very often buildings were being destroyed and walking on the street was very, very dangerous. Sometimes people would wake up in the morning and this would be what their house would look like. So this is in England. We are going through all kinds of things right now. And parents are trying very hard to keep their children safe. In this case, during COVID-19, this worldwide pandemic, we're staying safe by staying at home. But in England, it was dangerous to be living there. So a lot of parents decided that they would send their kids to a safer place. So the government helped by establishing this program called the Children Overseas Reception Board. And the guy in the middle is the head of the program, and he is, his name is Jeffrey Shakespeare, and he is posing with some children who are on their way to Canada. You guys, for some reason, there we go. Okay, sorry, I thought I couldn't advance my slide. It's very nervous making, being remote with nobody else here to help me, but I can do it. Anyway, these are the kids who are going to Canada. They all arrived safely, and in fact, thousands of children arrived safely in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, some in America, United States, in a different program, and they ended up living out the war, which was a long time, many years, away from their families, but they were safe. But then this ship, which sailed on Friday the 13th, September the 13th, 1940, was hit by a German torpedo. It was a raging storm at night. The ship sank within half an hour. There were 100 children on board, and I'm sorry to report that most of them did not survive. However, this is a story of heroism and survival, and I do focus on the survivors and the stories of heroism and bravery. So people do find it hopeful and encouraging because, as we all know, at a time of difficulty, you have to be resilient. And so many people in this story are models of resilience. So how was I going to tell the story? The first thing I had to do was do my research, obviously. I love using primary sources first. I try not to use secondary sources unless I absolutely have to. Now, what are primary sources? Well, interviews with people who were there at the time. I ordered records from the shipping company. I ordered records from the Navy, the British Navy. These told me all kinds of things, like where the ship was, what time this happened. People sent in reports after it, so I had many different accounts of what happened. Also letters, journals that people kept, memoirs and autobiographies that they wrote, and also I did some hands-on research. Now today, I'm going to focus on the things that you yourselves can do if you want to write about this pandemic, if you have a school project that requires research. So I'm going to talk a lot about interviews, a little bit about letters, and some about hands-on research. So I was really, really lucky in that the Imperial War Museum, which is this great museum in London, did interviews with a lot of the people who survived, most of them children. So I could access them online, sitting at my desk. And what's great is that a lot of libraries and archives have that kind of thing available to you. So, get some help from some teachers or a parent and look up some archives and see if maybe you could listen to some interviews. But it's also really great to interview people yourself. So I wondered, were there any survivors alive? I did a lot of research to figure out who was alive, and I discovered that the little girl on the left, her name is Sonia, spoiler alert, because you're going to know that she survived. Her name was Sonia Beck. She survived. She was 11 at the time of the incident. She is now quite old, but I was able to interview her. Now, I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to give you some of my interviewing tips. I've been doing this for a very long time, interviewing people, but I still have to remind myself about the best way to do an interview. So here are some tips. If you might want to interview a relative who lived through another pandemic, or somebody who's from another country and they were in a war, or somebody who maybe fought in the Vietnam War, or maybe you even have a grandparent or a great-grandparent who was in World War II. So tip number one is do some research first so you don't waste your time or theirs. So in other words, you don't want to ask them really basic questions that you could find out another way. You want to ask them the stuff that they could, the only people who could tell you. Tip number two is make a list of questions. Because you don't want to go like, I don't remember what I was going to ask you. Write them all down. However, don't be wed to your questions, because somebody may say something really cool and you want to be able to follow up on that. Like, for example, suppose you were interviewing an astronaut and the astronaut said, and I flew to the moon, which we know he an astronaut couldn't really do. And then she said, and you know what? It didn't taste like green cheese. It tasted like something totally different. And then instead of saying, well, what did it taste like? You said, and then how did you feel like when you came home? No, no, no. You have to listen and know what is the next really, really good question. Always thank the person at the very beginning and at the very end. So this is Sonia, how she looks now. This is a couple years ago. Not only did I get to interview her in person, but I got to stay with her for 5 days. My husband and I did. We looked through her scrapbooks, and I even got to hold, if you've read Torpedoed, anybody who's read it, this is the jewelry box that went into the ocean the 2 times that Sonia fell into the water, and I was able to hold it. It was truly amazing. Now, a lot of the time right now, you are not going to be able to interview somebody in person, but Skype is just as good. I Skyped a lot with Sonia, and I also FaceTimed a lot with another survivor who I'm going to tell you about in a minute. It's all the same rules apply, just like when you ask me questions later, you know, it'll be almost as good, not quite as good. We won't be able to hug at the end. I want to talk to you just a little bit about memory. If you're interviewing people about an event that happened a really long time ago, or you're reading somebody's account about an event that happened a really long time ago, they're going to get some things right and they're going to get some things wrong. So here's somebody who was in my book. Her name is Bess. If you've read Torpedoed, you know she's one of the 2 girls who clung to the overturned lifeboat for 19 hours. Again, she survived. So Bess gave a lot of interviews. I listened to her interview from the Imperial War Museum. She was on the radio. A lot of what she said was really interesting, and she was very articulate and smart. She was a teacher, of course, as was Sonia. I say of course because so many great people are teachers. But every time she told the story about what happened, she talked about it in a certain way. She talked about the fact that when the torpedo hit, her room where she was staying with 2 roommates got damaged, and one of the roommates was very seriously injured. So, and she said, and I never knew what happened to her. Well, when I went to England, I was able to look through some private papers that she had donated to the Imperial War Museum. And in those private papers, I found a letter that she wrote just a couple of weeks after the event. And in that letter, she said that she watched her roommate die. So this was a letter that was written 2 weeks after the event, as opposed to what she said a couple of weeks after the event happened. And I had to trust this one because this was right afterwards. Now, afterwards, you might want to ask me why I think she told it differently many, many years later. I have some ideas, and maybe you do too. I also want to talk to you a little bit about when people are reluctant. This is, sorry, somebody's trying to chat with me, I think. Somebody really need me? I hope not. Sorry. Let me just see if it's possible. Oh, I got a 5-minute warning. Okay. Sorry. Always go too long. So this is Johnny Baker, the little boy. His older brother died in the when the torpedo hit. He was very reluctant to talk to me. If you are interviewing somebody who is reluctant to talk to you, just be open and honest, like I was with John. I said to him, I am not gonna do anything or say anything that isn't gonna any way hurt you in this book, and you don't have to talk to me. And he told me a little bit, but he really, really opened up to me when I was open with him, and I talked to him about something traumatic that happened to me when I was a child and how I didn't like talking about that. So I got some more information from him, and what was more important to me was that he should be okay with it, and he is, and we are very good friends. So another thing that you can do that is great primary source research is look through old letters with people's permission. These are letters from this person in my story who was a hero, Mary Cornish, a teacher who single-handedly saved 6 boys' lives. This was a lifeboat that was not rescued for 8 days, and she saved their lives by telling them a continuous story. I found, looking through her letters, which her sister saved, so moving, I cried, because these boys kept up with her for the rest of their lives. And it was just very, very moving. Also in this suitcase was the notice that said that she had died, and then the telegram that came that said she was alive because she was recovered with all the boys 8 days later and survived. Now, also in that suitcase were something called condolence notes. Condolence notes are notes that people write when somebody has died. Well, when you write a condolence note, and you can ask your parents about this, you're pretty careful to say some nice things about the person. You don't usually say bad things, so you won't find out bad things about a person, but also to give details. So by reading the condolence notes, I learned that Mary Cornish had a great singing voice. I learned that she would put any thing from herself behind, she would put kids before herself anytime. Sorry, I'm rushing. And so if you are writing about someone in your family who has already died, for example, ask to look at the condolence notes that were written about that person, because you will learn a lot. You might learn that that person had a hobby you didn't know about, or went on a trip you didn't know about. It will help you to form a well-rounded picture of that person. So the last kind of research I'm going to talk about is hands-on research. Sometimes you can do something at home in the privacy of your home that will help you understand more about the person or the event you're writing about. So when I was writing about Vincent van Gogh, a painter, I watercolored. I am not an artist, as you can see. I just like to play with paint. But it gave me more of an idea of what his life was like, what it felt like to be a painter. Now for Torpedoed, I wasn't actually going to put myself on a ship that was torpedoed. I'm not that much of a, hands-on researcher. And I wouldn't advise that you do it either, but I could bake something, which I like to do anyway. I made something called hardtack, or ship's biscuits. You know what? These boys on Lifeboat 12 had to eat them and they didn't like them. And I wanted to know why they didn't like them. And guess why they didn't like them? They didn't like them because they were yucky. They had no taste at all. Except, as my son said when he came over and tasted them, if you put butter on them, they were delicious, because everything is better with butter. I'm going to end now. I want to say thank you for letting me talk to you. I hope you will have lots of questions for me later. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take a big gulp of coffee.
Thank you, Deborah. That was amazing. We're going to kick things over now to Karen Blumenthal, who is our second guest teacher. Karen is the award-winning children's nonfiction writer and longtime journalist. Her book, Bootleg, received 4-star reviews and was a finalist for the YALSA Nonfiction Award. Karen's most recent book, Jane Against the World, takes a deep look at the riveting history of the fight for reproductive rights in the United States. Karen lives in Dallas, Texas. Take it away, Karen.
Thank you, Katie. Obviously, I'm not at the beach. I'm at home in Dallas, but my desk is a mess. And also, I would rather be at the beach, and maybe you would too. So let's pretend, at least today, that we're at the beach. I'm going to share my screen too and take you to my presentation. So oops, come on now. Oh no, hang on, I'm sorry. Okay. My most recent book is Jane Against the World, as Katie mentioned. In this book, I actually did, like Deborah just said, a whole lot of individual interviews, because this is a story from the 1960s and 1970s, and people were still alive. And so I was able to get a lot of first-person responses from that, which I found really helpful. But you can't always do that, because that isn't always available. And I'm not, this is a contemporary history that's about a really important issue, and an issue that remains very controversial today, but it's for high school readers. So I'm going to talk more about Bootleg, which is a book that's a little bit for middle school and middle grade readers. For this book, I did a lot of other kinds of research. I read a lot of newspapers and books. I researched at archives where original documents are, and I interviewed experts. I did actually have one personal interview. I tried to reach people who had been alive during Prohibition, which meant at the time they were in their 80s or 90s. And I had written the Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, who was pretty elderly at the time, but still on the Supreme Court. And I got back a letter that said, oh no, he's not available. And then at the end of June, at the end of their term, on a summer morning, I got a phone call, and the woman said, Justice Stevens will speak to you now. And maybe you can relate to this today. I may have been in my pajamas. I may not have had anything to write on. And so I had to put her on hold and grab some paper and do this interview right away. I was sweating so hard that like I had to make sure I didn't smear the ink either. But it was a very exciting interview. And so I was able to get kind of a first person account. So Prohibition, if you're not familiar with it, was a 14-year period in America when it was illegal to sell or make any kind of alcoholic beverage, including beer and wine, and as well as hard liquor. It started exactly 100 years ago in January 1920, when America went, as they said, dry. And it didn't happen by accident. For decades, activists worked at it. In fact, the beginnings of Prohibition went back to the 1800s. Back then, the things that we drink today were not all that reliable. Milk could make you sick. There wasn't pasteurizing. There weren't water treatment plants. Water could make you really sick. So lots of people drank alcohol, which was amazingly safer. They drank rum at almost every meal. They took rum when they were sick, or they gave it to the baby when it cried. And men drank at saloons, which were sort of a community center for men, and some of them drank too much. So the first organization to fight the saloons was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was a group of women who were worried about protecting their families and their homes. And these women tried to shut down local saloons, and they called for temperance, or drinking moderately, or not at all. And if you were a total temperance person, that is, you didn't believe in drinking, well, then you were called a teetotaler. And that's where we get the term today for people who don't drink. One of the most famous of the WC2U women was a woman named Carrie Nation. She was a very religious woman who had married young and lost her first husband to alcoholism. She ministered to men in jail, and she came to believe that often their troubles were caused by too much drinking. At a time before women could vote, she believed that God told her that she should stop the bars and the saloons. So one day, she lived in Kansas. She went to a neighboring town, and she smashed up a saloon with rocks and with a cane. And she became famous for wrecking bars to make her point. She said famously, "You wouldn't give me the vote, so I had to use a rock." Because I write for you guys, and I want things to be true, like Deborah, I ran across times when the facts weren't always what you thought they were. One of the things that writers did, often male journalists or authors, did was they tried to diminish Carrie Nation and make fun of her and turn her into sort of a joke or a caricature. And one of the ways they did it was by describing her as unusually tall, as 6 feet tall, as Amazon-like, as unusually strong. And I was looking at pictures for the book, and I thought, wow, she doesn't look that big compared to other people. So I couldn't figure that out. And finally, I went to the Kansas Historical Society, which had pictures, and they said, oh, we have a dress of hers, and she's not 6 feet tall. She was probably 5'4" or 5'5". But that's a misconception that is continually repeated because somebody sees it in a book and they repeat it. In fact, even in some books that were published last year, I saw that again. The Women's Christian Temperance Union tried to recruit kids. They had their own kids groups, and even infants. So if you were born and your mother wanted you to be alcohol-free, she might sign you up as a white ribbon recruit, and you might have gotten these sorts of things in the mail to keep. The women were joined by a group that called itself the Anti-Saloon League, and that was kind of a religious group. It was led by ministers, and they sort of joined forces. The Anti-Saloon League was very big on printing information. So these are some of the flyers and posters they put around. As you can see, the focus was often on kids and the impact that drinking had on families. The one to the left, if you can't read it, says excessive death rate in drinking homes cost 2,407 children their lives. And the one on the right refers to boys, that the alcohol wants to get the greedy beast now gets 1 boy out of every 5. But the brewers and the liquor makers fought back. And this was an ad from a beer brewer of a toddler drinking. It says, "The youngster, ruddy with good cheer, serenely sips his lager beer." But despite all that, Prohibition actually, I mean, despite the fight back of the brewers and the liquor makers, Prohibition actually did happen. It started around the turn of the century with cities, local cities and localities, towns, banning beer or bars first, and then it moved to the states. And in the aftermath of World War I, when there was a great deal of anti-German sentiment, Congress passed the 18th Amendment, which made it illegal to sell any alcoholic beverages. Within a very short time, about 13 months, 36 states had approved it. Now, these were states primarily in the South and the Midwest, and this was a shocking thing for the people on the East Coast, in New York and Maine and Washington, D.C. and California. They didn't know what had just happened, but by the time people had voted, it was too late. On the very first minute of January 17th, 1920, Prohibition became law. And many people who had fought for it expected America to become a safer and happier and more moral country. But what do you think happened? Do you think people obeyed the law? Do you think that people followed what they were asked to do? Many did, because for many people, beer and liquor was too expensive to afford, especially if you were low income. Many people really believed in following the law, but a lot of people didn't. They tried to make liquor in their own homes. I actually researched how to make it, make moonshine and stills. It turned out it's much more complicated than you would think it was, and also really dangerous. Illegal bars opened, selling bootleg liquor or liquor brought from overseas. These are cards for speakeasies that would tell you how to get in or give you special names to ask for so that you could get into these bars. And law enforcement would crack down, but not for very long. They would raid some bars and pour the liquor or the beer down the sewer, but people continued to operate. This era gave rise to one of the most famous gangsters of all time, Al Capone, who built an empire out of illegal bars and liquor joints in Chicago. Capone was born to an immigrant family in New York, and he really didn't have much opportunity. He didn't get an education. He didn't think there was much chance for him. You know, in a different world, he could have been one of those billionaire businessmen. But instead, he turned to illegal businesses like gambling and lotteries. And Prohibition was this amazing opportunity. So he started in one territory and began to grow. He was also very ruthless. And if people got in his way, he killed them. He was believed responsible for this terrible massacre, the St. Valentine's Day murders of 7 people on February 14th in 1929. And ultimately, he was arrested and imprisoned, but not for murder, for not paying his taxes. But of course, Capone didn't see it that way. He thought he was giving people what they wanted, which was beer and liquor. He used to say, "Public service is my motto." Young people also rebelled during Prohibition. Sorry, I'm missing my chat. Young people also rebelled against Prohibition, and it was for the first time that men and women actually began to drink together. This woman has a flask that she carried. This is Leroy Ostransky. His father ran an illegal bar in New York, and Leroy brought them liquor in his music bag when he went to practice his violin with his father. He helped his mother make bathtub gin by diluting grain alcohol they bought from the pharmacist. And lots of other kids were involved in Prohibition too. They helped bring liquor in from Canada. They worked as lookouts, and sometimes they even drove moonshine from rural areas to the cities. In fact, some of those drivers became really good race car drivers, and that was some of the beginnings of the early NASCAR races and the famous people in NASCAR. With all this sort of illegal activity, mothers began to worry about their kids. In the same way they'd worried about their kids before, about their kids drinking, now they worried that Prohibition was making their kids into criminals and encouraging them to break the law. They began to ask for Prohibition to be repealed. And in 1933, with the Great Depression in full swing and prisons full with people who'd violated the law, Prohibition was repealed with the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, the only time a constitutional amendment has been passed and then removed in our history. So many people saw it as a great failure, but the amount of drinking and the number of people who died from alcohol-related illnesses declined sharply and stayed down for many years. one of the ways that Prohibition won over states was by teaching children about the evils of alcohol. The WCTU got textbooks changed so that they would warn students that liquor would make your muscles soft or your brain weak. So here's a picture that appeared in textbooks that showed what happened to your stomach if you drank. And this is a bit of a quotation. The alcohol is a liquid poison. A little of it will harm anyone who drinks it. Much of it will kill the drinker. And they took songs and they wrote new lyrics to them to encourage kids to think that alcohol was really bad. Perhaps you have a Red Ribbon Week at your school or some other drug and alcohol education where you also are sometimes encouraged to wear a bracelet or to make a pledge to be drug-free. So if you wanted to know more about Prohibition, you could do the kind of research that Deborah talked about too. You could look at your local historical society to see if there are if there's information about what happened in your community. You might be able to look up your local paper online through your local library and see what it said about Prohibition in 1920, 100 years ago. You could look at the Chicago History Museum or the Kansas Historical Society websites. You could make your own posters or even write your own speech to support one side or the other. And, you know, as Deborah said, 100 years later, we're living in a really historic time. You could start your own journal about this history that's going on. Or you could make up your own song. So here is one from Prohibition. I've asked some of our moderators to help me sing because I sing really badly. So we'll try this one. Are you guys ready?
I'm here for you, Karen.
All right.
Ready, Karen.
Are we ready?
Ready. Ready.
Alcohol is bad for me. It's very, bad for you.
You, sir. It dulls your brain and hurts your nerves and makes you
silly
silly
too,
too, sir.
Alcohol,
you can't fool me.
This is untrue.
I have
I have
to use my brains
My brains and keep my senses
too, sir.
So in trying to do that, I've written a really bad little song for today that we'll try and do, but you can do a lot better than this, I'm certain. But let's try it. You want to go, y'all, everybody, let's try this one. Washing hands is
what we do.
We
We rub and scrub our fingers. Soaping
up
up
for
for 20
seconds
means the germs won't linger.
COVID-19.
COVID-19, stay away. We don't want you never. COVID-19, go away. Leave us all forever.
So you can do much better than that. You can find other ways maybe to record this historical time. And I'm sure this is probably true for Deborah too, but on my website with any of my books, there are activity guides and discussion guides that you can also look up if you're looking for other things to do. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Karen. That is the first sing-along that we have had at the MacKids Streaming Schoolhouse, so you have really brought something different for us today. We are going to move now into the Q&A portion of our session, so if you do have a question for our authors, now would be a time to go down to that button at the bottom of your screen, open it up and start typing. If you are a young reader who needs assistance, you'll have time to ask a parent or a guardian to help you type out your question. And just remember to use your first name and your age as well so that we can make sure your questions get to the top of our list for our authors today, our guest teachers. We are going to kick things off with a question from a reader that was sent in advance of the session, so everyone else has a few minutes to get their questions typed out. We will start with this one, and this reader would like to know, what do you do when you have a great idea, but you're stuck on what actually to write?
I'll start with that one. If I'm really stuck, it means I haven't done enough research or I've done the wrong kind. On this particular book, Bootleg, when I was working on it, I embarrassingly spent almost an entire week trying to write about this section of history. And at the end of the week, I realized after I'd written and deleted, I didn't need it. It was not necessary. And so I just moved on. But that's sometimes what happens. Usually I need to rethink what I'm doing or do more research.
Yeah, and I would just say, ask questions, just ask questions. Like if you're thinking about an event or a person, just start asking yourself questions about what you want to know about it, and then start answering those questions, and you will start to accumulate material and you won't have a blank page anymore, which is always very helpful.
All right. Addison, who is in the 5th grade, would like to know how you get inspired to pick your topics.
I can answer that one easily for Torpedoed. I just finished writing Vincent and Theo, and I was thinking about new ideas, what I wanted to write. And it was my editor who said she had been to the Imperial War Museum and seen a child-size handmade life jacket in bright red. And she showed me a picture of it on her phone. And it turned out, can you see if I do this? You can see, this is the boy that it belonged to. His name was Colin Ryder Richardson. And she said he was on a ship that was torpedoed. Maybe you want to research that and see if you want to write about it. So sometimes you're really lucky and someone gives you a fantastic idea that you have to run with. Other times it just seems like I get an idea because I've read something or I'm very curious about something. The best way to write about something is to write about something that you really want to know more about.
That's so true. And the other thing for us, because we write for you guys, is to say what would be interesting to you. And so I thought Prohibition was interesting because in Texas, Red Ribbon Week's a big deal. And so it seemed to me that kids grew up from kindergarten on hearing about that. And I thought that made it more interesting. It's something that you're involved with. Steve Jobs, which is another book that I've written about. Well, I mean, everybody has something made by Apple, or many people are familiar with him. So the first question I have is, will students be interested in it? And then will I be interested in it too? Because boy, you spend a long time on it.
That's a great answers. Our next question comes from Ben, who is 9 years old, and he would like to know if you have any, what websites do you use to do research? If you have any recommendations for online resources for students.
It really depends on the topic that you're writing about. If there's a museum about that topic, very often that museum has fantastic resources. Like when I was writing about Vincent van Gogh, the Van Gogh Museum has fantastic resources. Another great place is the Library of Congress here in the US. And I think they're putting more and more online all the time. There are archives about lots of famous people. Very often, if you Google a person's name, you can get to an archive, especially if that person is super, super famous. Karen, you probably have some other thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's a tricky thing. And so I admire the question because it can be very hard. I do look for traditional resources like museums and archives and libraries. I wrote a book about Hillary Clinton. Maybe you heard of her. If you put Hillary Clinton's name into Google, you will get a lot of places that are not what I would call legitimate resources. People have a lot of opinions on these subjects. And it can be hard sometimes to cut through the opinions to the facts. So I do recommend looking for these more legitimate, the Smithsonian or other places that have more legitimate information.
And can I just add one more thing? And also to keep in mind that what you're looking for mostly, if you possibly can, are primary sources. So like when I was writing about Charles Darwin and his wife Emma, the people put online their actual letters and their actual journals. So there's a lot more and more online all the time of the primary sources. So go back and look at my list of what are different primary sources and talk to your parents and your teachers about what are primary sources and try to do those as much as possible. And you always have to double check. I mean, one thing that when I said about memory before that I meant to say was that when you're interviewing somebody, they may not get everything right. And so you have to go back and double check, like, was that really the date? Was it really raining that day? You can find out the weather anywhere in the world for almost any date, since people have been keeping records, which is really cool. What the phase of the moon was. Like I knew the phase of the moon for when the city of Benares sank. So, oh boy, researching is so much fun. Sorry, Katie.
It is.
Yeah.
All right, we have a next question from Zoe, who is 11. She would like to know what you wanted to do before you became an author. If anything, maybe you always wanted to be an author.
Well, I worked in journalism for a long time. So I knew I wanted to write. I was not a star writing student as a kid. My teachers used to tell me they knew my work because it was very plain. There was like no, no fancy stuff to get in the way. That turned out to be a really good fit for journalism. And then it was not a big leap from journalism to these books because I do a lot of the same kind of research. The other thing I wanted to be was a sports writer, but I interviewed some athletes and decided I'd rather be a fan than a sports writer.
I wanted to be a hairdresser when I was very little, but I'm not very good with my hands, so that would have been a very bad idea, cutting other people's hair, I think. And I really wanted to be, for a long time, I wanted to be a lawyer, the kind of lawyer who would save the world. Really what I wanted to do was save the world, because I was growing up in kind of a troubled time when there was a lot of injustice, and I really wanted to save the world. And so, but I always loved to write, and so I just kind of decided that writing for children would be my way of trying a tiny little bit to save the world.
Well, we certainly think that books for kids can save the world, so I think that you are doing it.
Books are magic. See?
Yes, see, exactly. We are going to wrap things up with one final question from a reader who would like to know what you are working on now, if you can share.
You want to go first, Karen?
Well, I have not really been talking about it in much detail because I'm running a little behind, but it might have something to do with a pandemic and vaccines.
Oh, cool. I'm going to show you, I always put on my bulletin board what I'm working on. So can you see? Working on this scientist whose name is Barbara Mcclintock. I'm doing a picture book about her. Please let me figure out her science well enough to explain it to 6 to 9-year-olds. And I'm also writing a book about that lady whose name is Clara Lemlich, who is a union organizer. And I was just able to talk to one of her granddaughters, and that was very, very exciting. And I'm working on like 50 bazillion other things, but also I'm just playing with my puppy a lot.
That sounds good too.
Thank you.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of our social studies lessons for today. So thank you so much for joining us and being our guest teachers and giving these young readers so many fun and exciting things to think about. Again, for everyone who's in the audience, just a reminder that this is being recorded, so we will be in touch shortly to include links to this session so that you can revisit the activities that Karen and Deborah have presented to us. And we'll also include some more information about both of their books and where you're able to find them either through your local library or through your favorite bookstore. And we will see you all tomorrow again for language arts. Right,
Thank you, everybody.
Bye,
Great to
thank
see
you.
you. You can email me if you have questions too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.